Alrighty, folks. Just finished up at the church and pulling out of the parking lot here. It's raining a little harder now. Alright, so the church has a Baldwin R. It's probably I'm going to say probably early 90s Baldwin R. So it's a Baldwin that was made in Arkansas. And not particularly the greatest era of Baldwin. I mean, most of the best Baldwins were made in Cincinnati. I mean, the ones from the 50s, 60s. A lot of them were basically Steinway clones. They basically used the same design. they just made it. And they were pretty good pianos. I mean, I've had pretty good success, especially with really older Baldwins, rebuilding them, and they have a nice tone. But as Baldwin sort of moved to Arkansas and changed their design, essentially just to make the pianos easier to produce, especially with the AccuJust hitch pins and basically allowing them, instead of having to build a piano where the pin block is glued into the piano and is sort of a structural element, which is a better design because it distributes the stress of the strings to the entire case of the piano a lot better. They basically went to a design which allows them to make everything outside of the piano, like the bridges, and just put them in, and then they can make the deflection of the strings on the bridge. They can adjust that by just moving the plate up and down. And so the pin block is just basically screwed to the plate, and the plate is taking all the tension of the strings, and it's not glued into the case of the piano. So it's really kind of an inferior design, in my opinion. I mean, you can design it that way. I guess it works. It just sort of, what it does is it greatly decreases the complexity of the piano when you're building it. Not having to plane down the bridges to the right height inside the piano. It just takes a lot less expertise. So the other issue with Baldwins of that age is that they have what's called AccuJust hitch pins. They're like these big tubular hitch pins, and the strings can basically be slid up and down on these pins to create the right bearing on the backside of the bridge. And the issue is that they're kind of wide open. They're not muted at all. So on a lot of these Baldwins, you get a lot of extraneous noise. You get noise from the non-speaking length on the back side of the bridge. You also get a lot of noise on these from the front side of the bridge, like where the string goes from the tuning pin to the capo. So you can get a lot of extraneous noise there too. So this particular piano, the hammers really need replacement. Some technician at some point just over-voiced them. I mean, he voiced them into oblivion, so that the hammers had actually gotten flat on top, which is what happens as hammers hit strings over and over and over again. They get worn flatter and flatter. And so the proper maintenance is to take sandpaper and essentially smooth them back out. But it appears that instead of doing that, to alleviate the brightness, which is also what happens as the hammers get worn, so the hammers get brighter, he just took needles and voiced them. So if you voice a hammer without getting it first into the right shape, what you end up with is a really dull, muted sound. Because flat hammers don't bounce off the strings nearly as well. So it's kind of like if you had a ball and it's flat on one side, and you drop it on the ground, it's not going to bounce off the floor. So the same thing happens with flat hammers. They hit the string, and ideally you want for that hammer to get off the string as fast as possible. So that's why typically hammers need to be a little bit more pointed on top. You know, depending on the piano, some hammers are sort of a gently round shape, and in others, you know, like Steinways or a lot of European pianos, they're almost like arrow shaped on top, so that they have an accurate strike point, and so that they get off the string as quickly as possible. It's really, really critical to do that. So already, if you have a hammer that's flat on top, it's not getting off the string as fast as it can, so it's muting the string. But if the hammer's really hard as well, it's going to give it a really, really bright, slappy, metallic kind of tone. So if you voice that down, you lose the bright and metallic, but you end up with muted and very little dynamic range. So the problem is these hammers now are so worn that I can't take sandpaper and get them back into the right shape again and still have enough felt left to where the piano will have good tone. It'll just sound really brittle and it won't have any fullness in body. So the hammers really need to be replaced. You know, and also the action in this piano is incredibly noisy. It has the knuckles are very, very hardened. It's like a round piece of leather that there's a little stick called a jack that pushes up on that, and that's what propels the hammer towards the string. And so when those leathers get really hard, they start knocking against the jacks really bad, and the repetition levers, and it sounds really clickety clackety. So we've got that issue, and then also it's got what we call pulley keys. So the keys, they ride on a pin in the middle, which kind of holds them in position, and those holes in the key have gotten too big. So it's what we call pulley keys. So you can actually pull the keys front and back, and they knock. So that creates a lot of extraneous noise too. So I have to go in, and they're pretty bad. I mean, it may be bad enough that I may have to go up the size of balance rail pin to take up the gap. Or, you know, if there's not quite enough for that, or if the key bushing mortises aren't big enough to accommodate that bigger pin, I may have to either glue size the holes to close up the gap, or I'll have to make new shoes, which means I'll have to route out where those holes are, put new pieces of wood and drill them out. I really don't want to do that. That is a pain in the rear end job, and a job where you have basically no room for error. And you know, I've got a jig to do it, and you know, I've done it before. It is not one of my favorite jobs. So we're going to hope that they're salvageable, but they want to wait about a year or so to do the work. They don't have the money right now to do it. It's a small church, and just like a lot of other small churches, they're struggling. And so in any case, we just keep it going for now, and you know, they're getting by. So we'll cross that bridge when we get there. So now I'm headed to yet another church, tune the sanctuary piano. It's a Kawai. I think it's maybe a GS40, something like that. It's an older Kawai, and it's starting to get to the age where it needs some work too. And it has a lot of tuning stability issues. Their sanctuary is incredibly volatile humidity-wise, and I've even installed a dam chaser and an undercover on it, and that is just enough to make it tolerable, so that I can actually attempt to put a decent tuning on it. But it's always a project when I tune it. It's the tenor section of the piano goes extremely sharp and extremely flat with the season, so it'll be interesting to see what I find this time. It's kind of an intermediary tuning. I generally tune it twice a year, although sometimes it ends up being more like 3 or 4 times a year. And I tuned this thing back in September maybe, so this tuning is probably just to make it fresh for the Christmas concert. You know, which is kind of typical. A lot of churches will have their normal tunings, and then they'll sometimes throw in an extra tuning at Christmas just to make sure it's fresh. So it shouldn't be as bad, since I just tuned it maybe 3 or 4 months ago. You know, so we'll see how it did. But anyway, I'll check in after that, and talk to you later. Thanks.